You probably realise that I'm a new face to the day, and I've just joined. I'm Anshuman Mondal. I'm Associate Dean of Research here at Faculty of Arts and Humanities. It's a great pleasure to be able to chair the final session of the day. There are 3 papers which will then be followed by questions. And I won't take up any more time. I'll ask Susan and Pat James from the University of Southern California to come forward and deliver their papers. I'll just give you a brief introduction to Patrick. So he's the Dana and David Dornstein Dean's Professor of International Relations at the University of Southern California. And he's the author or editor of over 30 books and more than 170 articles and book chapters. He's received the Donner Medal for Canadian Studies and the Governor General's International Award in Canadian Studies. James has served as president of the Association for Canadian Studies in the US from 2007 to 2009, and president of the International Council for Canadian Studies from 2011 to 2013. So I'll hand over to you, Susan, to Patrick.
Okay, thank you very much, Anshu. So I'm going to start by telling you a story. Common to plan of everything that's happened so far today. But basically the story is of getting to know Patrick James over a 20-25 year period in our work in Canadian studies and our work with various Canadian studies and international subject associations on area studies. And that really has been the journey that I'm just going to reprise a little bit of that journey, which has led to the setting up of this new Area Studies Research Centre at the University of Anglia when I fell amongst thieves and friends. And to tell you a little bit about the book that Pat and I are working on at the moment. So it is a work in progress. It is not yet finished. But it kind of fits in with some of the ideas that have been discussed this morning, but also perhaps points to a slightly wider direction, I suppose, in our contemplation of area studies. So I'll just start off by doing that. Okay, so the context of our work and the book that we're doing at the minute is obviously a context which we have all endured, and that is the proper word for it, I think, the massification and marketisation of higher education, both in the UK and in the United States. And over a career of 25 years, Pat and I have seen how university life has changed over the period of time when we have been teachers and researchers. And the kind of pressures that have been applied to teaching, to research, and to universities themselves in terms of managing their own funding and getting funding from students rather, I suppose, from central pots or from the state. And along in that journey, and this will cover some of the material that's in our new book. Along that journey, we have moved, I suppose, in our consideration of studying only Canada to our studying of Canada and other places. And part of our interest in that came because we were both people who worked in comparative research. For a long time, I worked on research in Canada and also research on the European Union. And Pat, who is an IR specialist, a political scientist, and originally a mathematician, which is an interesting little aside, also worked on very many countries apart from the United States. And I suppose this has led to our arrival into this world, this new world of new area studies. And sometimes I think Vincent Hubin gave us this sort of picture this morning that he felt a bit like Charlie Chaplin here, trying to keep the wheels turning and the wheels on the bus on a daily basis when he was trying to keep his Area Studies Institute afloat. And I think many of us would identify with this issue. However, along the way, it became very clear to us, and I think some of the other colleagues this morning have intimated some of this experience as well, that we realised that there had been a sort of organised critique of Canadian studies. This is both within Canada as a country, and indeed there was a particular attack on Canadian studies by a number of historians a number of years ago, who were kind of outlining some of the issues that Philip mentioned in his presentation earlier. They seem to believe that Canadian studies within Canada was too descriptive, too self-referential, not engaging in enough analysis, and really of not much interest or use to man or beast. So this was something that, as political scientists, we became. I started off as a political scientist, and I often tell people that I quickly fell out of love with it because it constantly referred to structures rather than people, and I thought it was the people that was more important than the structures. However, Pat and I, as political scientists, had conversations about this problem that Canadian studies had. Why was Canadian studies not as good as history? Why was Canadian studies not as good as literature or English, etc., etc.? Name any discipline. You know, we were basically considered and often referred to as being the kind of also-rans in the Canadian academic heaven, I suppose you like to put it that way. Well, you know, I think that we were a bit perturbed by these criticisms. We were annoyed by them. We were labelled as amorphous. We were seen as too interdisciplinary, and we were seen as lacking in rigour. The key responses to those criticisms were that we felt it was very, very important to preserve what we call the humanistic side of research. Rudy Sill, who will be our speaker later on this afternoon, has written about this and has talked about it as well. But we felt that we were fed up with the disciplines guarding the gates and saying, you can look at this, you can look at that, but you can't do it this way, or you can't do it that way, and you can't look at that because it's not part of ours. And we said, where's the joy in this? Where's the joy of curiosity of research and finding out new things and discovering new ideas and contemplating new things which actually inform what we already know? So we said, don't forget the joy of listening to unfamiliar topics and arguments. One of the things to say about this is that Canadian studies conferences, traditionally, both inside Canada and outside Canada, have been interdisciplinary. And so you would get historians, people who were studying literature, people who were social scientists, and it didn't go a lot beyond that, but it was very, very interdisciplinary, and we liked that. And often I would have gone to panels to listen to something that I absolutely knew nothing about. And it was in that panel that I might have found something that really piqued my interest to where I wanted to take my own research next. And of course, that was, you know, going outside the black box. That was the dreadful thing to contemplate, the dreadful thing to imagine. But for me, whenever I was doing both my PhD as a mature student and work later on, that was where I got my interest. That was where I found my joy. That was where I got the next problems, and that was where I wanted to dig. And I didn't care about who told me I couldn't do it. So I did it. I think a lot of people still don't like that. But I think the point of area studies is to look outside the boxes, to look over the boundaries, to look beyond the disciplinary gates and look outside that box. So the journey that I've undertaken, and this is just my personal journey, and Pat may say something about his own, is that I became secretary and president of the British Association for Canadian Studies, and I know some of my colleagues are in the audience, the online audience today. I then became president of the International Council for Canadian Studies in Ottawa. Now, that was really quite a revelation, because what happened was that therein there were around 20 different international organisations who were promoting the study of Canada around the world. The only continent that was not represented around that table was Africa, and that's a historical oversight, I think. But however, what became very interesting in the conversations around the table were that people had very many shared concerns and shared interests, sometimes different, but often shared. And so it gave us a network, both Pat and I, because Pat also was president of that association, and it gave us a network of colleagues all over the world, globally. And that was really useful to help develop our ideas about, you know, why we need to study comparatively, why we need to find out about places, and why we need to understand fully what's going on in particular countries, regions, subnational bodies or whatever. We also, both of us have worked with the Government of Canada. I have done research on immigration to Canada, which was very interesting. I noticed in our very first panel this morning, there was reference to, you know, violence, to conflict, to post-conflict ideas, overcome. Joachim was talking about post-conflict peace building. These things spoke to me very strongly because of my own experience in Northern Ireland and because of my research in Canada, where I looked at and talked to new immigrants to Canada who come from conflict zones. And so I think sometimes our shared experiences are often what are useful and drive our interest in knowing more. I also was involved in work on economic development in Canada and the EU. So that journey led on to, in 2010 to 2014, being Deputy Chair of the Area Studies Panel for the Research Excellence Framework. For those of you who perhaps are from outside of the United Kingdom, that's our national evaluation of university research. In 2014, for the first time, we brought together all regions of the world, well, at least a substantial parts of the world. We were a combination of 4 previous area studies panels brought together as one area studies ref panel. And at that time, I know there was great anxiety that perhaps these people who were studying different parts of the world would have nothing to say to each other and wouldn't be able to hold a conversation. You know, could a Middle East scholar have something to say to a French scholar, to a Latin American scholar, whatever? But of course, what we found was, yes, we had loads of things in common. We had loads of problems that were in common. And we had many curiosities that we shared. And that really began the fight back, from my point of view, of area studies in the United Kingdom. In the 2014 ref, there really wasn't submission of research on area studies in the United Kingdom. And I noticed that as the Deputy Panel Chair, and I was quite perturbed by it, that there really hadn't been institutions that were submitting theoretical ideas on area studies in the country. And so at the end of the ref, I started to have a look at what was published in the UK on area studies, and I started then to write about that myself. And Pat, James and I wrote a book which was published in 2018 about new area studies in Canada and comparative perspective. I also contributed to a book that Zoran, our speaker later on this afternoon, wrote a terrific book on the rebirth of area studies published by Bloomsbury. I advocate reading it, it's top notch. So we started, some of us started to have conversations about what was happening to area studies in the United Kingdom and beyond, because we knew that this wasn't just these losing jobs, the closing downs of departments, the merging of units with other disciplines wasn't just something that was happening only here in the UK, it was happening globally. And we wanted to fight back about this and say, we had something to say, we have something to offer. We are as good as the disciplines, and listen to us, and this is why. And that's basically what we've been doing ever since. I also served service on the executive of the UK Council for Area Studies Associations, and we've got the president with us today, Nick Selby, at the back here. And that was very interesting as well, because that is a subject association made up, a network body made up of 18 area studies bodies in the United Kingdom and the British Academy. In 2017, then I became chair of the ref panel, the sub panel, and really I think ever since then we have been writing and speaking about area studies and the arrival of new area studies. That's just a list of some publications on new area studies. Now the challenge, and I think Vincent Hoban has told us the challenge this morning. He laid it out for us very plainly. How do we make area studies a new emergent discipline? And I thank Stephanie for the opportunity to help mold that as we go forward. And also to say, as well as the New Area Studies book series with Routledge, we also have a New Area Studies journal, which I will mention, an open access journal, which we have created here at UEA. So that might be something that people are also interested in. Now, I'm not sure if you can see all of this, but this is a summary of Vincent's 2020 article. And I'm going to, at this point, ask my colleague, Pat James. Pat, are you, I don't know whether Tom has to do something to get Pat to join us, do you? I have to see where he is. Oh, you're there. You're there.
I just unmuted if anybody can hear me.
Okay, Pat, good. Unmute. Now, would you please tell us what this is and why it's important?
Indeed. And you did such a great job in talking about your journey as an area studies scholar. There's a paradox that we need to resolve in order to succeed. One is that we really want to be interdisciplinary. And that means a lot of different vocabularies, you know, theoretical frameworks, methods and approaches that in some cases are quite distant from each other. It all could become unintelligible as a result. At the same time, we're uncomfortable with any sort of hegemonic method, everybody telling us what to do. For instance, well, we're all going to be data scientists or ethnographers or whatever. The riddle or the paradox, if you will, is how do we talk to each other in a way that is mutually intelligible and relatively easy to pick up? That is the purpose of what you are looking at. It is a systemist diagram, and I have limited time, so I'm only going to talk about the basic properties of this diagram rather than its components. Who needs this? What is the purpose? One can learn how to draw pictures, if you will, that are commensurable with each other, that have a common grammar, notation, however you'd want to put it, in literally a couple of hours. You could learn how to create a diagram like this one. The diagrams are one-page summaries of the arguments of academic articles, chapters, and books. So for example, in this case, Hubin 2020, this is a wonderful article that engages New Area Studies with Southeast Asian Studies. This diagram is commensurable with any and all others that would appear in an archive, and that archive is building. If you look at the inner box and the lower right banner, you will see area studies. So the inner box is what's going on in area studies. The outer box, the world beyond, is simply the complement, everything that is not within area studies. If you look at the lower level boxes, you will see that they are written in lowercase letters. What that indicates are processes going on involving individual scholars, their writings within area studies. In particular, in this case, Hubin, the author himself. This is tracing out aspects of his particular observations about the field. Then in caps, up top, uppercase letters, are processes going on within New Area Studies itself. And I'll just say very briefly about the shapes and colors. The shapes and colors help us, based upon educational psychology, to grasp the contents of the publication and are easy to remember. So for example, at the end, you can see red octagons, stop signs. Those are termination points in the argument. And a green oval up top is the starting point. Green means go, red means stop. You see the orange diamond down below? That's a pause. So a green oval means that you're at the starting point of argumentation. A red octagon means that you're at the terminal point. And orange, like a traffic light, for instance, means pathways dividing outward. I have no time to get into all of the other notation. You'll see a purple hexagon there. That's a node where there's multiple pathways in the argument coming together and then breaking out again. This diagram can be compared to literally any other diagram we would create within any branch of area studies. I'll just say quickly, what does it say? What Hubin starts about is observing a lack, if you will, of engagement, a particular kind of engagement with Asia and the global South. And by the time we're done, it's a happy story that Southeast Asian studies can, I'll just read one of the octagons aloud and then I'll stop. Southeast Area Studies is one of the most dynamic and intellectually vibrant fields in area studies. You get to that particular point of termination by following the argument. I'll turn it back over to Susan and be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Pat. So I wanted you to see this at this point because the book that Pat and I are doing is doing a couple of things. One, it's trying to further define new area studies. Two, it's looking at this new methodology of systemism to understand area studies. And it's doing that by reviewing recent arguments in the literature on new area studies. So we have reviewed what we thought was a good section of the new literature over the last 3 or 4 years of what has been said about new area studies. And we have turned them into these graphs. So what we're doing is we're summarizing the arguments of what new area studies might be, where it started, where it's going, but this is all recent stuff. Now we're only looking over literature that's come out in the last 3 or 4 years because we had done a review of the literature for our 2018 book. So, and also at the same time, Zoran's book had also reviewed a lot of the literature. So there is stuff there before 2018, 2019, but this is really the very recent stuff, the last 4 years, you may say. So we have done these graphs, these visual aids, if you like, to arguments relating to new area studies. We have reviewed another literature, which I'll come to in a minute. And from that, we are going to do a sort of, I suppose, a place and point or a point of time where we are in the development of new area studies at the moment. And so I'll not go into that in much depth in a minute because it's still a work in progress. But I just wanted to show you that this is the new methodology that we're using in our work, and it hasn't been used in area studies before. So that's the first thing. Now the challenge, Hubin laid out the challenge for area studies as a discipline earlier on, but the challenge we think post-COVID has become more urgent. And enough to say that today we nearly lost 2 of our speakers. COVID has not gone away. The government would like us to think that it's all gone away and it's just like flu and it comes out once a year and we can all get jabs against it. Well, it hasn't. The rise of the zoonotic diseases, etc., you know, this has not gone away. It's something that has changed the world. And we think that the challenge for area studies post-COVID is one which has become more urgent. The title of our new book is New Area Studies, Capabilities, Wellbeing and Health, the State of Play After the Pandemic. And this is going to be the first of our series that we've described. And Stephanie has mentioned a few moments ago. Now, as far as we're concerned, new area studies will adopt a distinctly interdisciplinary approach ranging from ethnography to big data. So we're moving beyond social science to understand complex and wicked social and political problems. We will be looking for innovations and methodologies. So we're very happy to have the ones that we know about, but we want you to think creatively about new ones. Moving beyond the humanities and social sciences into new approaches, including visual graphic data and other things. You may have other great ideas that we have not yet thought of. We are interested in an innovative theoretical approach combining, this is in our book, the capability approach to well-being, new area studies using our novel research method, systemism. Now, why do we think COVID has been so important? Well, we think that what's happened since COVID is that the systemic inequalities around the world have become more clear. Sadiq Osmani, who researches in Bangladesh, said that he felt that what had happened represented the single-minded pursuit of economic growth, even at the cost of human misery. That it was this push for economic growth, no matter what else, that actually became evident in the course of the pandemic. And what we've seen around the world has been a large-scale destabilization unleashed by the pandemic. This destabilization goes beyond sickness, it goes beyond death. We are seeing increased conflict, we're seeing more power struggles, we're seeing challenges to bad governance, we're seeing enhanced awareness of natural hazards, we're seeing amplified life-threatening situations. Now, to be fair, Pat and I had picked up many of these criteria by 2018 when we were writing our book at that time about new area studies. But we do feel that things have been increased in speed and seriousness since the pandemic. And this notion that Osmani had, you know, that the economy must come first and that people are way, way down the list and people's quality of life is way, way down the list of what's important in life. We see loss of livelihoods, we see increased poverty, we see worsening of social and economic inequalities. And McGann and Murphy and Manley have said, as a result of all of this, that in 2023, business as usual is no longer feasible. We actually have to take a second look at what's going on. We need, and this is something that Pat and I feel quite strongly, fundamental changes to our ways of knowing. We need to better comprehend the realities of lives lived in unremitting poverty. Listening to the dialogue in the UK at the moment simply about the forthcoming election, how often do you hear the terms, you know, credit crunch, problem, people not being able to afford the cost of living? We are the 6th richest country in the world. When you take the other countries and you look around the world, you think, you know, if it's like that here, what's it going to be like elsewhere? So even we as a collective are seeing the outworking of the pandemic, you know, we're all experiencing it. So from our point of view, new area studies needs to search for innovation in area studies research. It needs to search for new methods and new theory. Now, this is not something that has just, you know, appeared on the horizon and come from nowhere. In 2018, the OECD demanded better policies for better lives, noting that gross domestic product was being used as a proxy for economic welfare and general welfare, and that GDP was not designed for this task. You'll not be surprised, this is Stiglitz, Fusey and Durand. They also argued that we have to move beyond the focus on GDP as post-COVID inequalities are widening. And I think this is sort of fairly well recognised, that pre-existing but previously ignored vulnerabilities have been cruelly exposed with tragic costs to human lives and economies by the pandemic. Now, we're still seeing this. One of the things that I wondered about in the course of the pandemic and when we were in lockdown was whether, I mean, I watched my own father, who during the time of lockdown was 82 or thereabouts, and I watched him decline within the first 6 months of lockdown. And that was a decline which was based on simply not having contact with other human beings. Both, and perhaps this was, you know, a particular personal experience of mine, but not only did I lose my own father during this whole period, but I also lost my father-in-law. And both of these elderly gentlemen just seemed to be casualties, indirect casualties of the pandemic. And I wonder what's happening to our older citizens in the wane of the pandemic. But not only those people, I wonder what's happening to people who are economically, educationally, physically challenged, people who have protected characteristics of one kind or another. I think the world is becoming less fair. And this worries me considerably. So I think that new area studies going forward needs to focus on the human. That we need to accept that COVID caused the deepest losses to human development in centuries. We have seen multiple decreases in quality of life around the world. The OECD has said that in most countries, the basic capabilities of health, education, housing, nutrition, and social connection have been compromised. I think we need to look at understanding what's going on with different approaches. And one of the things that interested me has been Amartya Sen's capability approach, using this as a way to analyse the efficacy of future policy interventions and creating a framework that focuses clearly on human outcomes rather than economic outcomes. Can we create then a capable area studies? This is one of the questions we'll be posing. The capability approach is concerned with ensuring that different people, cultures and societies can achieve the freedom, and note this, to live the kind of life they have reason to value. And I think this speaks to Joachim's talk this morning, you know, the values of the persons themselves, not our values, not a government's values, not an international association's values, the person's values, the community's values. The capability approach acknowledges that money and material things are important for achieving a good life, but there are not always a strong link between income and resources on the one hand and the capability to achieve the most valuable freedoms on the other. In other words, people may have the same amount of money, but one person may be enabled to do much more with that amount of money than another person because they start at different points of opportunity and of ability to integrate into society. And while happiness may be significant for many people and many societies, there are many other concerns, for example, hunger, health, literacy, and rights. And when we're thinking about those things, we also have to consider the social conditioning and adaptive expectations or preferences of the people themselves. And if you notice this morning in our first raft of presentations, how often it was said, you empowered us. You know, there were women or young people talking about being empowered. And I think this is to do with the social conditioning of the context and of the place. And this is as true for us in the UK as it is for anywhere else in the world. We need to be thinking about, why do people expect less for themselves? So can we contemplate a capable new area studies for every individual? Will new area studies be empowered, broadened, and made more wealthy by using insights from the capability approach or from elsewhere? Can we examine the genuine opportunities that are available to every individual, taking account of that individual's abilities, attitudes to transforming their capabilities into what the capability approaches workable functionings, and that is basically what they are able to be and do. So, for example, let's say you're comparing me to somebody who has not had a higher education. You give us both the same amount of money. Are we likely to be able to do the same things and achieve the same things with that same amount of money? No, because I have the great advantage of a higher education and a lot of experience both in work, and also I live in a highly developed country. So what I'm saying here is we need to think about equity and equality as well as simply amounts of dough. So can capable new area studies inspire forward-looking public discussions within and between societies, cultures, identities and place? Can we explore social values? Can we promote conversations on public reason, which is a sort of taking some of those ideas that were mentioned in the first session this morning and raising them up? I think it's kind of what you were talking about, Joachim, in a way, you know, putting out to a wider audience some of these questions. And COVID-19 has increased our public knowledge on health, the desire of citizens to be involved in active debates about social priorities. So we have the arrival of new area studies, responding to increasing speed and complexity of 21st century problems, incorporating ideas and concepts from beyond the boundaries of existing paradigms. That's extremely important. Bringing together colleagues in the UK and beyond, using all the weapons from interpretivism to big data, going beyond the arts and humanities and social sciences into science and related fields to solve our wicked problems. And lastly, to demolish the archaic disciplinary boundaries that have prevented us from reaching our potential in earlier years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan, and taking the final. Our next speaker is Professor Zoran Milutinovic, and he is Professor of South Slav Literature and Modern Literary Theory at University College London and member of the Academia Europaea. He is author of 6 books, most recently Phantom in the Library, 2022, and the co-editor of 3, most recently the Rebirth of Area Studies, which is the book that Susan referred to earlier, and Translating the Literatures of Small European Nations. He's the Associate Editor of East European Politics and Societies and Cultures, and also co-editor of Brill's book series, Balkan Studies Live. Over to you, Zoran.
Thank you very much. Let me begin by extending my thanks to the organizers, Susan, to start with, for inviting me to come here. It's really an honor to be present at your launching event and to share your joy at being the center, the National Center for Area Studies at the moment. And also, I would like to apologize for my presentation, which will be informative, but rather dull. And written with spelling mistakes, which I noticed only this morning on the train. So apologies for both. My thesis is that area studies scholars should stop worrying and learn from comparative literature to love their place among other fields of knowledge. Protean forms of academic inquiry are no less respectable than constant and fortified ones. If one's field of inquiry changes each time one asks a different question, and this brings about a new conceptuality, different methods, and altered relations to other fields, this is all for the best, provided that the question points into the right direction. Area studies and comparative literature have occasionally been linked to one another in the past. Gayatri Spivak, for example, in her book Death of the Discipline, defends the claim that area studies and comparative literature can and should work together. Comparative literature, she maintains, can supplement area studies, mitigate the arrogance of area studies, where it retains the imprints of the Cold Wars and offer as a dowry what was the best of the old comparative literature, the skill of reading closely in the original. What is more, comparative literature supplemented by area studies, she says, can transcend its traditional textual focus and begin to speak to us about questions and issues which concern us not only as readers of literature, but as human beings with various ethnic, cultural, national, political, and gender identities. Thus, ironically, two academic fields, one of them constantly concerned with its own survival, and the other admittedly made redundant by the forces of globalization and by the end of the Cold War, could revitalize each other and perhaps forge an amalgam which would put forth what is the best in each. The purpose of this amalgam of comparative literature and area studies would be to resort to somewhat old-fashioned expression and to avoid reducing the problem only to the fiscal aspects of academic policies, to know the world outside its Western Euro-American core. At the time that Spivak voiced her call for mutual fertilization between comparative literature and area studies, much of what she proposed had already been taking place. And it is safe to claim that one part of her proposition has been accepted. In its earlier periods, comparative literature had only European literatures as its normative horizon. It was created by scholars who would, in addition to their own, typically know 3 major European languages, which would bring their claims to a level of generality unattainable by those who studied only one national literature, again, typically only their own. Area studies, by contrast, although retaining the same tacit European normative horizon, were always the study of the non-Western, meaning non-European and non-North American world. Thus, Spivak's proposal could aim at the way area studies and comparative literature can supplement or complement one another. Comparative literature would add the missing area to the catalog of existing area studies, and thus not only fill the cartographic gap, but also supply its own specific disciplinary insights, to which I will have to return later. However, the Eurocentric normative dimension of comparative literature was hardly as indisputable at the beginning of the 21st century as it had been during preceding decades. Since the 1980s, the rise of post-colonial studies has been one of the two most important academic developments, the other, of course, being gender studies, which transformed the profile of all of the humanities and a significant section of the social sciences. Although post-colonial studies is a research field and not a discipline, its earliest disciplinary base, its very place of origin, was comparative literature. And this is where the pressure exercised by the ideas, concepts, and aims of post-colonial studies has been felt most. The West European normative horizon is either gone altogether or made to appear insufficient, anachronistic, or plain wrong. This is certainly a major achievement for a discipline which from the very beginning claimed to address the totality of human literary production. The price it had to pay for this success was a certain loss of recognizable disciplinary profile. This loss, as all losses always are, is experienced as a crisis. The old traditional area studies were also affected by the development of the post-colonial studies agenda. While comparative literature had the advantage of being able to recognize it as one of its earliest aims, area studies had nothing similar to rely on. The loss of normativity seemed detrimental to it. For example, for several decades, the notion of modernization served as the conceptual axis around which practitioners of area studies organized their research. Modernization was understood as Westernization, which reduced everything deemed non-modern and non-Western to objects, I quote, defined and grasped only in terms of their relationship to the West, the end of quote, as Timothy Mitchell put it. The West was posed, claims Mitchell, as a model that cannot be replicated faithfully. And historical itineraries, political forces, and cultural phenomena were included in the paradigmatic area studies narrative only in order to measure an area's suitability to or divergence from the narrative of Western modernity. Thus, all other parts of the world were, quote, made to appear as particular instances of the universal stories told in and about the West, concludes Mitchell. When this normative horizon began to crumble under the pressure coming from various directions, including the post-colonial studies agenda, the core narrative was lost. Instead of as a Western export, modernity is nowadays better understood if seen as a continual constitution and reconstitution of a multiplicity of cultural programs, as Eisenstein proposed. Mistaking modernization for Westernization means assuming a priority of origin over process, of geography over history, as Lewis and Wigan claimed. The Western understanding of Western modernity is based on a particular historical and intellectual tradition which cannot claim universal validity, and the same universal idea can take different shapes in different places and historical contexts, as Chakrabarty maintained. With the loss of the conceptual axis, the normative horizon enshrined in it was gone as well, and what was left tended to become fragmented into millions of pieces impossible to put together. Without a paradigmatic story and the normative horizon to guarantee it, what exactly should we look when examining areas? Thus, comparative literature would not only supply the missing European or Western area and fill in the gap on the map, but would also bring a salutary non-normative approach. Much work of dismantling this normative horizon has already been done in other disciplines which contribute to the area studies project, as the quotes from the previous, which I just presented, testify. My sources were 2 historians, 2 geographers, and 1 political scientist, and the list of similar quotes could be extended if the prescribed length of this speech could allow it. Other disciplines do not need comparative literature to tell them that the old normative horizon only distorts the picture, as they can find evidence for this in their own libraries. Losing this horizon is an imperative if area studies are to continue their existence. Yet, its disappearance is experienced as a crisis. Linguisticality is a word coined by Hans-Georg Gadamer in order to express Heidegger's idea that we have the world only because we have language. The world is not environment, but a web of meanings spun within language. I'm recalling this concept here in order to underline an important feature of area studies. How are novels and poems useful if you want to understand an area? The branch of phenomenology to which both Heidegger and Gadamer belong maintains that whatever else stories may achieve, they also create a meaningful society and make possible an ethical sharing of the common world, as opposed to the merely common physical environment. Telling a story is a communicative act through which a society establishes what it means to be human, to be a saint or a hero, to be honorable or happy, or to live with others. And this act constructs tacit background understandings which to all members of a society seem natural and universal. Or to put it differently, individuals become members of a particular society if they share the same tacit background understandings. These are preserved in and communicated by society's stories, which point to them or present them to us, usually without precise and explicit definitions. Inspired by Heidegger's reinterpretation of the notion of the world, so not the totality of entities, but the web of meanings which construct our self-understanding and the understanding of everything else around us, phenomenology sees cultures as the totality of significance which we share with one another. The world is always the one that I share with others, as one of Heidegger's most memorable theses goes. Cultures prescribe normative patterns of interpretation and conduct through their languages. Different worlds can be intersubjectively shared only if they're articulated in languages, which bear and transmit tacit pre-understandings of something or other. We share a meaningful world because it has already been previously linguistically articulated. We get to know it not through innocent and fresh perception, but through becoming accustomed to the ways everything in the world has been previously understood and interpreted. Language records and stores those pre-understandings in its most developed forms in speech genres such as paradigmatic story, habitual everyday expression and proverb, and literary genres such as myth, epic, history, folktale, romance, confession, prayer, chronicle, essay, novel, poem, play, newspaper article, etc. These genres not only offer an unrivaled opportunity to examine the world's webs of meanings sedimented in languages, but also make it possible to see how these worlds came into being through contradictions, paradoxes, ambiguities, and uncertainties, and develop through processes of narration and symbolization in such a manner that the level of conceptualization is rarely achieved, and yet a specific world still emerges. Understanding a particular world, a historical one, such as the medieval world, or a synchronic one, such as the Chinese world, is only possible if one is familiar with the background understandings this world's language creates, stores, and communicates to its speakers, and thus binds them into a society. They become members of the same collectivity if they share these meanings, and strangers and foreigners if they do not. Hence, the language genres we are accustomed to calling literature are not studied in the context of area studies only because areas have literatures as they have rivers and mountains. Rivers and mountains become a particular area distinguishable from another when alongside them a specific tradition of storytelling takes root. The study of literature is the study of those speech acts and literary genres. It is certainly not only about intersubjective articulation of a world through language, as it approaches those language genres from many different perspectives, but it does also include that. There is no other humanities discipline which has developed such sophisticated tools for the close reading of cultural texts, spoken or written, in the original language as the study of literature. It is most natural, necessary, and unavoidable basis of area studies, and it is quite understandable that the first area studies academic programs developed in the early 20th century from language and literature academic programs, as they still do evolve in this direction in our time. If the question is, how can the study of literature complement area studies, the simple answer is by doing what it has been doing so far, through close reading of cultural texts in the original language, and uncovering the pre-understandings of the world into which all members of a culture are initiated, and through this initiation taught to share a world and to be bound into a society. One of the negative starting points in this process of convincing should be the rejection of what I will tentatively name the quest for essences. Area studies are reproached for failing to fully integrate various academic disciplines around a common thread. Such an integration, we are told, would result in the production of a full, complete, total presentation of an area. The assumption behind this reproach is that everything in a given area fit seamlessly together with everything else. The object under study is animated by a perfect coherence and integration, which area studies fail to translate into a logically coherent and integrated representation. At the core of this coherence and integration is an assumed, but not yet brought to daylight, essence of the area under study, which radiates into various aspects of reality and which must be present and detectable in them. Our academic disciplines deal with those various aspects, but they continue to analyze and explain them more or less independently of one another. As a result, instead of the essence of the Middle East, of this specific Middle Easternness, which makes this area different from, say, Southeast Asia and Southeast Asianness, hidden deep beneath the phenomenal surface, we are only given a set of perhaps true, accurate, well-founded, and evidenced insights, which still fail to describe the essence. Logic, coherence, and integration must be proper to reality, it is assumed. If our account of an area consists of various elements which do not coherently fit together, though not necessarily contradict each other, as they may not fit simply because various disciplines approach it with interest in various processes, various temporalities, and elements belonging to different orders, and does not point to the essence proper to it, we have already failed to give a true account of it. For, as Hegel put it, the true is the whole. The whole is guaranteed by an essence. There is nothing anyone can raise against interdisciplinarity, save that interdisciplinarity is a very, very difficult thing to do. What goes under this label in many academic journals and publishers' lists is more often than not an application of the concepts, methods, and interpretative protocols of one discipline in the section of reality normally entrusted to another discipline. Sometimes it brings forward unexpected and valuable insights. Sometimes it misses the point altogether, as we all know all too well. This is not a reason to stop trying, but neither is the challenge of being interdisciplinary effectively a good reason to look down upon the second best and less glamorous multidisciplinary endeavors. The latter can be unsynchronized, out of step, and incoherent, as they do not assume that logic, coherence, and integration are proper to reality. Universal suffrage, liberal democracy, high modernism in arts, and sophisticated intellectual culture on the one hand, and appalling levels of illiteracy and infant mortality, underdeveloped agrarian economy, and minimal capital accumulation on the other, are not supposed to be the emanation of the same essence, yet they sometimes do come together. The account which points to this would have to be based on contingencies, different temporalities, discontinuities, contradictions, breaks and reversals. If nothing fits in with anything else, and the object under study does not seem to be animated by a perfect coherence and integration, but rather is incapable of being translated into a logically coherent and integrated representation, it might be better to stay closer to what one sees and can truthfully describe than continue the quest for essences and reproach the method for insufficient interdisciplinary integration. Perhaps there are no essences, just contingent and contradictory processes. The whole is the false, as Adorno put it. Closely related to the quest of essences is the obsession with purity. It comes in various guises. Firstly, as a variant of the quest for aerial essences, which by definition must be pure and uncontaminated by features belonging to others. Secondly, as a methodological and disciplinary purity, which demands that every sphere of academic inquiry have its own clearly demarcated domain and a method appropriate to it, and deems everything else a breach of disciplinary protocol and a methodological eclecticism, which ipso facto bears only invalid results. However, even before the 20th century globalizing cultural, political, and economic processes irreversibly destroyed any uncontaminated aerial purities, if they ever existed as such. The reality of inter-aerial relations was creolization rather than a jealous guarding of some putative aerial purity. This does not mean that globalization and the processes which preceded obliterated all aerial distinctions and specificities. Globalization, as many other historical processes, produces contradictory results, dismantling some borders while simultaneously creating the new ones, homogenizing and differentiating, integrating and disintegrating at the same time. Area specificities are preserved in the unpredictable results of creolization, which are never simple sums or regular synthesis of all elements involved, but incalculable and contingent hybrids brought about by unending primation and, as a reaction which it provokes, attempts at purification. But a lot more important is the question of disciplinary and methodological purity often raised in discussions about area studies. This kind of purity is the legacy of the late 19th and early 20th century academic divisions, of the heroic period of the social sciences and humanities attempts to establish themselves as clearly distinct entities, and to divide human reality into domains appropriate to each of them. This process was far more complex than today's common departmental conflicts over resources and land grabbing, and to a certain extent the opposite of it, as it concerned each discipline's self-understanding and the search for their appropriate and unique methods. The point was not to appropriate what may have been the domain of other disciplines, but to exclude any reference to what may be others' territory, and to focus on one's own specific and unique interests and method. The last third of the century, however, 20th century, I mean, brought about a plethora of impure methods, often borrowed from other humanities and social science disciplines, or sometimes resulting from the modifications and adaptations those methods acquired during their long trajectories through various disciplines. For example, new historicism in literary studies developed in the 1980s hybridized Foucault's discourse theory developed on the ruins of structuralism's purity with the social interests of the Annales school of historiography and Clifford Geertz's thick description method, which was itself an adaptation of new criticism practice of a close reading of literary texts to phenomena studied by cultural anthropology. How very impure, created to be able to simultaneously address texts, language, culture, and history, this method would certainly fail the test of what is your unique object and your method appropriate to it, to which area studies are sometimes subjected. The moral of this story is not only that the disciplinary focus on essences and purity should be abandoned, as most disciplines engaged in area studies loudly advertise their anti-essentialism and openness to methods and theories developed in other disciplines, up until the point that the discussion turns to area studies, when the usual reproach regarding the lack of a clearly defined object and an appropriate method makes itself heard again. The point is rather to recognize how comparative literature successfully dealt with similar objections. In what follows, I will point out some similarities and certain differences between comparative literature and area studies, and put forward the thesis that the object of area studies is not readily available, but constructed in the process of research, and is dependent on it, meaning that the area studies should assume metaphorical rather than metonymical modus operandi, and that the methodological uncertainties are not a shameful insufficiency, but a source of strength. To a certain extent, comparative literature can also be viewed as a field composed of disciplines, which are various national literatures. This is an imperfect analogy, as national literatures, although dividing human reality into distinct entities, such as French or German literature, still share the effort of defining the exact object of their common interest, borrow theoretical concepts and approaches from each other, and labor towards the same aim, understanding the anthropological constant of human groups producing oral and written texts considered to be literary and distinct from non-literary language use. But the analogy is instructive in the sense that comparative literature is in the same position regarding its component disciplines as area studies are regarding their components. What is it that comparative literature can give us that is not already given by the sum total of its disciplines? Instead of collecting, rearranging, and ordering the knowledge already present in national literatures, after several decades of trying to define its specific and unique object, comparative literature became a testing ground for methodological and theoretical innovation. To the extent that all theoretical work became routinely classified as its natural subject. This was not entirely accurate, as much theoretical discussion was still carried out within the scope of individual natural literatures. But the fact that whatever was produced under the label theory became instantly recognized as comparative points to the fact that there was a free, unoccupied space between and above national literatures which comparative literature was to fill progressively. The nature of this theoretical production was interdisciplinary by its very nature. Beginning in the 50s and the 60s, linguistic structuralism was appropriated by literary studies and transformed into a universal interpretative method suitable for all the humanities and some social sciences as well, thus reversing the process of disciplinary purification and confirming the claim that approximately every 50 years, the humanities and social sciences agree on the need of having one universal method. The rise of structuralism occurred half a century after the demise of positivism, which at the beginning of the 20th century played this role. In the 70s and 80s, Derrida's and Foucault's post-structuralism became almost hegemonic humanities and social sciences methods. Oh, okay. There will be some skipping of this paper. Area studies should hopefully this is 7, no? Area studies should assume a similar position with regard to their component disciplines. They should not try to be a sum total of all disciplinary knowledge about an area, which is a fine thing, normally called an encyclopedia of, but not a very dynamic field of academic inquiry, or even imagine themselves as the mortar connecting disciplinary bricks into a larger whole. Area studies should generate questions which no single discipline concerned with an area can ask, focused as they are on objects established by tradition and verified by practice. These questions can arise only if area studies are to change their understanding of interdisciplinarity, which is at present limited to asking the questions arising from the framework and interests of the discipline, and requiring all other disciplines to provide their contributions to fleshing out the answer. To be able to do this, area studies must abandon the quest for their proper object, which can only lead back to the search for essences and areas, or expose area studies as inferior to the disciplines which do not have such concerns. The proper objects of area studies will disappear or keep appearing in different shapes and forms as a result, not as a starting point. The objects will be brought about by various methods with which we approach an area, or various contexts in which we place them, and various questions we ask about it or them. I'm advocating a metaphorical model of knowledge, as opposed to the metonymical model of knowledge, which I sadly have to skip now. The metaphorical model of knowledge would abandon all pretense that a total integrated knowledge is possible. Even disciplines can claim to be offering their knowledges as total and integrated entities only if compared with even less totalizing ventures, such as area studies. Examined individually, all disciplinary knowledge tend to be far from a whole, neatly fitted and all-encompassing, however pure the method and integrated the results. While a metonym taken rests on an assumed spatial overlap between a part and the whole, and on at least partial identification, a metaphor does not. It is based on dissimilarity between entities which often belong to different orders, love and emotion and rose, a physical object. However, this dissimilarity reveals an unexpected, fresh and new connection between two things. By transferring or carrying over a thing from one order to another in which we choose to find its equivalent, a metaphor puts it into a new context in which its new dimension, feature, or characteristic is revealed. And I'm offering, as a model for metaphorical knowledge, a book which probably most of you know, and at least it is easily acceptable and you can read it if you haven't read it already. Orientalism by Edward Said is a book based on the metaphorical idea of knowledge. It demonstrates first how an area is constructed. Middle East does not exist in nature by itself, as opposed to Syria, Egypt, and Iraq. It is also based on the impurity of disciplinary knowledge. It asks a question, what is an area? How is the area of Middle East constructed? And shows to you that there is nothing natural in constructing an area. An area appears as the answer to the question we ask. And the question which constructed the Middle East was, how should we rule them? Said created this model of knowledge by thinking metaphorically. He could have said, the Middle East is like sexuality. Sexuality exists as a concept only, as opposed to sexual acts. And the analogy is Syria, Egypt, or Iraq, which are sexual acts in this comparison. The object is not the object of area studies thus constructed is not the Middle East per se, but the way it is constructed. And Said's method was an interdisciplinary genealogical perspectivism, which is created on the intersection of philosophy, sociology, history, and linguistics, created actually by Michel Foucault. The trigger question, why do people in power in Western societies say such things? This is what created such a model. I think I've overstepped already my allocated time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker today, I think we'll just get him up.
Yes, I just checked it. Are you there, Rudy? I think I saw you join.
I am here. Can you see me?
Yes, perfect. And we can hear
Can you
you. Thank
see
you.
me or hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so our final speaker today is Rudra, who is Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. Since 2011, he's been the director of the dual degree Huntsman program in International Studies and Business. And he's the author, co-author or co-editor of 7 books, including Managing Modernity, Work, Community and Authority in Late Industrializing Japan and Russia, Beyond Paradigms, and a book which has been honored as a Choice Outstanding Academic Title. Sill's volumes include comparative area studies, methodological rationales, and cross-regional applications. His paper in comparative political studies was awarded the Dorothy Day Award for an outstanding Labour scholarship. So I'll hand over to you, Rudra, to bring our debate to a close.
All right, I'm going to try to share my presentation. So let's see if that works well. I should be able to just share this, right?
Yeah. If you click the share button, it should give you some options. It's on the top right.
Yep, I hit that. So my PowerPoint is not showing up. Oh, let me see here.
Yeah.
There it is.
We have got it here if you'd rather.
Yeah, maybe it's better if you do it from your end.
Okay.
I seem to be running into all these privacy blocks.
Sure. Okay, let me just get that on the screen.
And I'll try to make it obvious when to switch forward.
Yes, just give me the nod and I will I'll advance it. That should be up now.
Great, fantastic. All right, so some of what you'll be hearing from me is going to overlap a little bit with what we just heard from Professor Milutinovic, which was fascinating. Thank you for sharing all of those perspectives. But my perspective is going to be a little bit more from the home of political science, even though I'm not a pure political scientist. But I have been teaching here in the political science department for nearly 3 decades, and before that, did my PhD at Berkeley in political science. So that's the vantage point from which I've been able to discuss and think about area studies and its evolving fate. Go ahead and fast forward to the next one. So I'll start with a quick look back at area studies, how as it evolved in the US, which I imagine is a little bit different from the way the story evolved in Europe. Particularly because in the US, I think the development of area studies and investment in area studies was deeply intertwined with the Cold War, and the amount of resources that was devoted right after World War II was focused on gaining a more detailed knowledge of the enemy, the Second World, let's say, or of understanding which of the developing ex-colonial countries of the so-called Third World were most suitable as allies for the U.S. as the countries that were evolving most reliably in the direction of liberal capitalist democracy. Academics in this context became essentially allies of policymakers, aided by massive government funding for language study and area expertise. In the U.S., we refer to this mostly as Title VI funding. It's still around, much smaller now, which is one of our issues. But Title VI funding for area studies centers was the primary way of funneling resources. And in the particular context of understanding the enemy, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, Title VIII funding was especially devoted to that. As geopolitical as it was, one thing that came out of it that perhaps wasn't intended or controlled by government was the thriving of cross-disciplinary area studies associations. And as we just heard, area studies, the purity of the disciplines was in fact gladly sacrificed for a while in order to explore these connections between the humanities and the social sciences, among the social science disciplines, and the definition of the areas started to kind of emerge around the way it had been structured in the discipline of history, but was replicated over and over in other social science disciplines. And within political science, it took the form of a home in a subfield of comparative politics, where comparison was not necessarily the main point, but it was the label given to the assortment of area expertise. Interestingly, I think in the early going, though there were a lot of different methods. There were interpretivists, there were ethnographers, there were people studying historical transformations, people studying statistics, descriptive statistics. There was no fundamental confrontation over methods. I think the reason was that area studies and the social sciences and humanities collectively sort of dealt with the outside world, I think, within the framework of modernization theory, which I think, if we were to borrow Khrushchev's phrase, allowed for a sort of peaceful coexistence of quantitative and qualitative research, a division that nowadays in political science is rather sharp and clear, and sometimes contributes to some very passionate debates over hiring and promotions, at least in our departments here. But modernization theory, I think, allowed us to bypass that because there was a sort of loose overarching framework predicated on a bunch of assumptions that were not to be tested or questioned. But be that as it may, it did allow for people who were interested in deep history and people who were interested in descriptive statistics to coexist and deliver information about different countries and different areas. Go ahead. Next slide. So I think the end of the Cold War has a lot to do with the decline of area studies funding, especially in the United States. And I shouldn't say decline in the sense that area-based expertise was downgraded altogether. People were still emerging in the field of comparative politics and political science with some sort of an area label. But I would say that the 1990s was devoted to disciplining area studies. And I've said Pache David Layton because he is one of the major leaders of using this language, how to discipline the discipline. And by this, he meant an extreme focus on rigor and one of the main indicators, regardless. And here's the issues about quantitative versus qualitative method, formal modeling, the way to bring all of this together under one rubric in order to do a better job. But I think the larger environment needs to be talked about first before we understand how this methodological shift has impacted area studies training in the US. First, I think with the end of modernization theory, which was long overdue, you did have new battles emerging that made it impossible to kind of just think about area studies as a place where all kinds of approaches would coexist. In particular, rational choice theory, which I've abbreviated here as RCT, and historical institutionalism were seen as alternatives, not given to much peaceful coexistence in the early going. I think the end of the Soviet bloc, starting with the fall of the Berlin Wall, really created this atmosphere here of the old style qualitative area studies have failed because the end of the Soviet bloc was not seen clearly. I would say this was completely an error, because I think there were plenty of people talking about cracks in the system, identifying tensions, identifying problems that were growing in scale. And yet the narrative was that the failure to predict the end of the Soviet bloc told us just how non-rigorous the old style area studies was in the US, and therefore we needed to bring more rigor into the story. And of course, since we no longer needed to worry about geopolitical confrontations with the arch enemy, sharp cuts were seen in funding for those Title VI grants. So in terms of resources, in terms of a framework within which the attention could be shifted away from analytic or methodological debates, in terms of the standing of area studies in all these areas, we see that the 1990s, the end of the 20th century, brought about a radical shift in the environment. And within political science, this was tied to this extreme focus on this idea of rigor and a narrow understanding of rigor. Even though everyone was committed as a mantra to methodological pluralism and problem-driven research, this is what you saw in every dissertation, every book, every article. We're all methodological pluralists. We're all interested in problem-driven research. And yet the drift was towards identifying some type of unified principles, some type of shared standards. I don't know if this abbreviation of KKB is as common in England or Europe more generally, but here it's part of our biblical study of methods. King, Cohen, and Verba, who published a book in the mid-90s that became like the starting point and sort of a heroic attempt to kind of create a unifying, uniform understanding of method that accepted qualitative, the coexistence of qualitative, quantitative, and interpretive work, but insisted on a common rubric, deliberately and consciously ignoring the empiricism that was underlying that, ignoring other epistemologies, but no one was in a position to sort of call this out. A few of us were. I certainly did this. Timothy McEwen also wrote about sort of the unstated underlying empiricism and this quantitative worldview kind of filtering into shaping what kinds of qualitative research and in the areas was appropriate and tolerable as rigorous. So this is sort of a overall shift in the environment as well as within the discipline of political science. The next slide. Despite this, I would argue, and I have argued, this is in my paper in the Sage Handbook of Political Science published in 2020, the area of studies, I think, survived. They didn't survive with a lot of resources, but I think it did, this shift to focusing on rigor and the assumption that the old area of studies were fundamentally flawed and unhelpful, this perspective, you started to see some sort of pushback. I think among the points that were made was that it was out of the area studies that you found the information, the arguments, the interpretations that exposed the hollowness of modernization theory, exposed the particularities and complexities that made it impossible to have this sort of neat evolutionary paradigm of development and change, and created the possibility for new ideas. These new ideas included concepts that are now enduring and portable, concepts like corporatism, which came out of originally a single country study by Philippe Schmitter focusing on Brazil, or consociationalism, something we talk about all the time in terms of creating space for multi-ethnic states. All comes out of Arend Lippard's single country study of the Netherlands. And of course, the developmental state came out of deep expertise on political economy of East Asia, looking at how the capitalist development state in Japan and also then in South Korea and Taiwan experienced rapid growth through a distinctive form of guided capitalism that could be portable. So these are all ideas that have stayed with us for a long period of time, and yet they did come out of single country, single area studies. And I think at the end of the day, we needed a shock to the system, and that shock came in the form of 9/11, where you started seeing an emboldened group of scholars pointing out not only the past accomplishments of area experts in the social sciences, but also the need for further training, further resources for language study and area expertise. Francis Fukuyama, who's perhaps better known for his end of history speech in the 1989, actually wrote a very articulate plea for restoring the position of the area studies. Charles King wrote a wonderful foreign policy article talking about the dangers of quote unquote flying blind as we were dealing with new shifts that were not expected in the 1990s, which was a period of peace and optimism. But after 9/11, that atmosphere was punctured. And so I think there was this uneasiness that maybe we just don't know enough on the ground. So I think at the end of the day, area studies did survive the shifts that were happening. The only question is, what happened in its wake. Next slide. This is just a quick table to show you that area focused, country focused work was dominant, especially in book length studies. If you look at all the books that were surveyed in the field of comparative politics, which again includes the aggregation of area focused work, these were books reviewed in the Perspective on Politics journal, which has a large, regularly published book review section. I had my graduate student count up the number of books in the sample from 2006 to 2013 and code them in terms of whether they focused on one country, one area, or more than two or more areas. And you can see that 85% of those works were limited to one area. Next slide. But that's really not a basis for reassurance for us, I think, in the sense that this interest in one area belied the way in which the areas were understood in relation to positivist political science in the 21st century. And I think people were increasingly uncomfortable with the fact that the trends in other areas of methodology and epistemology in the discipline were exposing trade-offs. So it's possible to survive as an area specialist, but also not really be able to do one's craft, not able to invest, not able to sustain accumulation of knowledge. And that's what we start seeing happen in the 21st century. Methodologically, the push for generalizability and rigor in political science meant that area expertise, while convenient and helpful and interesting, was to be subordinated to these supposedly uniform rules of causal inference, including following rigid scriptures of case selection. So this made the inherent interest in a country or area somehow anathema to rigorous social science, rigorous political science. And in practical terms, if you think about the way we understand area expertise as something that involves sustained investments over time, investments in maintaining language skills, investments in the accumulation of knowledge, and the cultivation of contacts and networks, not only for one study, but for a succession of studies. This type of deep knowledge, the participation in area studies conferences and conventions, the multidisciplinarity we just heard about in the previous talk, these aspects were not being rewarded by the discipline. What was being rewarded was focused work on the top flagship journals of the discipline, the big interesting debates on China or India or sub-Saharan Africa were taking place in the area studies journals, but this was not being rewarded. The citations there did not count for so much. Publications in those journals didn't count for so much. So from a practical standpoint, young scholars may have become sufficiently expert in the areas to produce their dissertations, but the idea of continuing to maintain an identity and a professional visibility in multidisciplinary area studies fora and arenas, that was not being rewarded at a critical time when these young scholars were interested in trying to get tenure. Now, the typical response for how to make all this work has been to use the language of multi-method research. So we do qualitative area research is valuable, but within the context of its role in multi-method research, something where area-based knowledge and information would coexist with something a little bit more borrowed from the quantitative or formal side of the discipline. For example, in revealing contextual information necessary for the proper design of a field experiment, or the use of a case to illustrate the causal mechanisms or linkages that would support a theoretical model or a causal inference. Next slide. So multi-method research was supposed to be the way in which pluralism was expressed, but as I've argued in another article with a former graduate student, Amel Ahmed, what it did do, in fact, was actually bypass again the issues of epistemology and ontology in order to create this sense of a big tent, but effectively ruling out true qualitative focused area research. This is a not intentional outcome, but it was an unfortunate outcome. Multi-method research did not ultimately resolve the trade-offs, but what it did do was actually promote the thinning of area expertise. The general claim that the supposed benefit was not as strong as one expected, the idea that you would, through different methods, would have cross-validation and error reduction and get closer to the truth, ignored the fact that many of these approaches were incommensurable in their foundations. The probabilistic logic of statistical means, the deductive logic of formal modeling, the sequential logic of process tracing, or the interpretive logic of studying meaning making. These were fundamentally different kinds of insights. I think it was perfectly fine for them to coexist and bring in different insights, but to stuff them into a single research design in the hope that doing so will, produce error reduction and create cross-validation for one's hypotheses, that assumption, I think, was taken for granted without any systematic, clever, careful thinking about what it implied. But within the downside of multi-method research was even more pernicious, I think, for area expertise, because once again, though people went around with the label of having been trained in the expertise of one country, one region, the way in which that training was conducted was designed to be very functional, very instrumental. So it became harder and harder to distinguish studies that were based on genuine accumulation of area expertise and sustained training from what I like to call Wikipedia case studies that were quickly done on the side and cobbling together a few sources and then supposedly demonstrating the reliability of a causal inference based on statistics. If you look at the top general disciplinary journals, standalone qualitative work was almost impossible to find. Every now and then, out of 50 articles, one or two might achieve that, especially if dealing with a big country like China. But in general, the top disciplinary journals, which is what was rewarded in the profession here, is still being rewarded in the profession here in hiring, promotion, tenure review. Those journals were heavily focused on showing rigor in the more traditional sense through statistical work, through formal modeling, through survey experiments. And in that context, deep knowledge of areas was not valued, especially if it was on its own. Political theorists sometimes smuggled in area-focused work, political philosophers, and there was always a tradition of publishing one such article in every journal. But typically, again, on the ground, qualitative single area work was almost impossible to find and is still impossible to find. So local knowledge was not devalued completely, but it was treated, I think, in more and more instrumental terms. How well do we know the location where we want to carry out a survey experiment or a lab in the field experiment? And most importantly, there was almost no responsiveness or engagement with the multidisciplinary area studies debates that were going on in the conferences organized around area studies associations, Association of Asian Studies, Association for the Slavic and East European and Eurasian Studies. These areas were still going on, but almost without political scientists. In fact, a colleague of mine published an article, some of you may know her, Anna Jamal-Wabusa, where have all the political scientists gone? So they were moving away from active participation in these area-focused conferences and really investing more and more on general disciplinary training and rigor. So all of this, again, did not lead to the disappearance of area-focused labels, but heavily disincentivized investment of time in language, in deep area knowledge, and successive cases of field research that would not only be done during graduate training, but also be reinforced over a career. So single method, single area expertise really has gotten thinned out in the process. So next slide, please. In this environment, I've been very active with a group of scholars throughout the US, but also in Europe. We have especially formed a useful functional partnership with the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, GIGA, in Hamburg. And we've also been reaching out to colleagues in England. Susan, you've been privy to some of this already, along with Pat. And Tim Power at Oxford has been also become an ally in this. And this is the promotion of what we call CAS, Comparative Area Studies, which emphasizes a distinctive way of understanding comparative study, which is cross-regional, but heavily focused on contextualizing the comparison. So this is an approach where the first thing I want to say is it's not meant to supplant area studies. I'd rather say you can't spell CAS without area studies, without AS. It is not intended to overcome those trade-offs that multi-method research failed to do, but rather a distinctive strategy for managing them while aggregating knowledge in distinctive packages. And this, most importantly, starts off with the assumption that area expertise is valuable in its own right. It's not serving some instrumental purpose. It's not serving multi-method research. And yet, the insights that are being generated from that expertise are being connected to those that are being generated in other area studies communities, at least two or more, so that if there are distinctive patterns or shared patterns, those can be yet collectively presented to the discipline in ways that are more visible, more compelling, harder to ignore at a minimum. So this is distinct from past iterations where people have made the case for million, after John Stuart Mill's small n types of comparison, which is meant to mimic the logic of statistical work in terms of case selection, in terms of representative samples, and so on. But nor is it limited to idiographic studies where the focus is more on a single context and thick description. We sort of try to locate this somewhere in the middle, closer to generating middle range theoretical arguments and insights, things that can be portable, but within very limited contexts, within the context of a very specific problem, not intended to create general models or general theories or covering laws. And the comparison, thus, is not just for inference, nor limited to descriptive contrast, but rather contextualized comparison, where the same indicators and observations are contextualized within their respective countries or areas, and only then do we think about comparison. So it's a different kind of comparison that doesn't fit well with the going definitions of rigor or the idea of ideal nomothetic social science. But I think we have adapted this language from earlier iterations for the very specific purpose of defining comparative area studies. Next slide, please. Just a few names that I think of, at least within the American political science field. People have traveled this route. So the career path is actually very important. Evan Lieberman, for example, who's at MIT, started off as a South Africa expert, and then even as a graduate student, added Brazil as a case, immersing himself in it, learning the language, figuring out the local debates, and then producing a comparative study. And in his later work, he actually extended that to India as well. Elizabeth Wood at Yale did a massive book on El Salvador, but then took a portion of that and explored the extent to which that could be compared with debates that were similar on similar issues in South Africa, and produced a paired comparative book as well, comparing El Salvador and South Africa. I won't repeat all of these, but just you can see it on the side, Atul Kohli, Dorothy Solinger, Stephen Hansen. These are all cases where the case selection is not purely Millian, in that at least one case is about expertise, deep expertise, sustained expertise, where one has established themselves as fully in control of the debates and scholarship and nuances and complexities of studying that country on the ground, and only then start bringing in other cases with an awareness of the kinds of complexities that studying any country or area involves. So next slide, please. To this, I would add my own first book based on my dissertation, which was mentioned earlier, Managing Modernity, Work, Community, and Authority in Late Industrializing Japan and Russia. I was trained more as a Soviet and Russian specialist with Russian language training, with multiple visits to Russia, even during the late Soviet period. Japan was new for me. I did not learn Japanese, but I immersed myself in Japanese studies and multidisciplinary Japanese studies, took on a research assistantship for 6 months, and did what I could to get myself up to speed, because for the particular problem I was interested in the context of Russia, it was Japan that was the most appropriate comparison, and the debates within Japanese studies were the ones that I felt were most valuable, engaging. So the way in which I distinguish this from just simply plucking out cases is that there is in this book an appendix where there's a discussion of Western historiography in Japanese and Russian studies, so that the kind of argument I'm offering can be situated in a logical way vis-a-vis contending country-specific narratives, so that one can say that there's not, you're not selecting the most convenient interpretations for generating comparisons. So the dual audience here, not just a social science audience, but also an audience of those participating in country-specific debates, that's sort of the distinguishing feature. Next slide. So if we were to just simply define this as an approach, I'd point to four things. First, training and expertise in at least one area, which I think creates a portable skill set in the sense that it gives people awareness of the context conditions in other areas. If you know how messy it is to know one area and know it well, spend time there, develop context, and engage with the issues and debates going on, then I think you're not going to just simply parachute into another area and just plug in what you need. You will have an ability to kind of explore the context. Second, the problems, concepts, and causal narratives that are being exposed should be relevant to more than one area, more than one time period. So at least the problems should be traveling. So that's the one area where an area-focused research can actually convince the discipline that it's important. We permit lack of expertise in language for every case. It's kind of impossible to simply tack on perfect expertise every time you identify a case from a different region. But with careful reliance on translation, with well-sampled secondary sources, with some degree of immersion in the debates and scholarship, it is possible to ramp up the level of understanding of a country beyond that which we typically see in a small n, a million analysis where only the variables of interest are plucked out. Finally, I think we expect a self-conscious effort to explore horizontal connections between different communities of area experts, as well as vertical links to general concepts and theories in the discipline. Horizontal and vertical are obviously not meant to suggest any kind of hierarchy. I'm just trying to imagine it in terms of the two dimensions along which communication can be advanced. And that communication, I think, can simultaneously reinforce the value of area studies and create insights, I think, that convince the discipline that there is something of relevance that was being missed through the standard methods of multi-method research and the standard designs of field experiments, the things that are most valued, supposedly. Next slide, please. I think just with keeping an eye on the time, I'm happy to get back to this issue of what to do about language and expertise. But these are not simple things. I don't necessarily advise graduate students to be trying this, partly because I think this is a longer term process in terms of how you add layers of knowledge and start engaging new area studies communities. It can be done as a graduate student. I did it, but it was very difficult and risky, and I would like to think that I just got lucky. But I think this is an issue to be considered. Next slide. A second set of issues that is related because of the language issue is the reliance on primary and secondary sources. And I do want to say one thing about this because I think this is something that is critical to manage. I think the distinction between these two types of sources is often generalized and overemphasized because it is possible to use secondary sources where there's plentiful there, and be careful in your sampling, be careful in understanding the sources of different debates and where the assumptions are and where these narratives are positioned vis-a-vis each other, and where one's own eventual interpretation of a case is positioned vis-a-vis these contending historiographies. So there's definitely work there where selection bias in dealing with secondary sources is something that one can be conscious of and try to actively push back on. And by the same token, primary sources is not a panacea. It doesn't solve any problems. It does mean that you're going to some source that's primary, but which ones? And you can see debates among historians almost become debates about which sources they happen to prioritize in their fieldwork. So I think there too, when sampling is important, and secondary sources, ironically, can play a role in kind of creating a wider array of primary sources that you're relying on, because those sources are being cited and brought to light, and it's easier to try to have a bigger understanding of the various kinds of primary sources through that. So I don't see this as the kind of challenge that justifies limiting comparative area studies. Next slide. And I'll just sort of wrap up by talking about that even if you're not fully convinced about the ways we can overcome the challenges, it's worth comparing the challenges to the gains. And here I've tried to sort of highlight what it is about this particular approach, this cross-regional contextualized comparison, which does depend on having first and foremost initial area training in some area that one is fully invested in. How does that stack up against typical things? So I've tried to look at expertise and portability as two different dimensions. And typically, if you focus your entire career on a single country or a single area, the level of expertise is very high, but the portability commensurately low. On the other side, you have large N work or macro comparative work, where the focus is on specific variables that are plucked out and somehow interconnected in a theoretical model. And there, the expertise required is comparatively lower, and the portability of the finding is supposedly higher. And so we're trying to come up with an ideal typical middle ground in between this, where the level of expertise in the second or third case might be medium level, not so for the first area that anchors one's identity. But the portability too is up to the range of middle range theory, at least for a certain set of problems, can yield some insights. And final slide. And I also think that as scholars with similar interests, it'll become easier for us to deal with certain issues. And again, maybe I'm speaking too much from the perspective of US political science and especially the field of comparative politics. The practical costs we suffer here has to do with the fact that we're dealing with three dimensions of differentiation, three kinds of heterogeneity, not just variation in our core substantive topics, which can go from studying ethnic conflict and nationalism to democratization or authoritarian backsliding to political economy of development. But we also have variation in methods and approaches and our philosophical foundations, our epistemologies, and we have variation in area-specific expertise and skills. So unlike, say, international relations, where you have two of these dimensions at work, that adding that area-specific differentiation really creates three dimensions. So you can imagine in this space how difficult it is for a big cluster in one corner of the subfield to communicate and be aware of the visibility and contributions of another cluster. So communication, dialogue, awareness is critical here. And I think comparative area studies can at least play a dialogical role here in trying to sort of mute some of the gaps that can emerge when you have this three-dimensional space where one corner will be completely unaware of the existence of another corner. And this gets in the way of, for example, in very basic things like who do you pick for reviewers? How does a journal editor of a top disciplinary journal understand who's well qualified to study a particular article that is focused on on one of these corners? Promotion issues, who do you go to for tenure letters? And just general visibility and professional identity. These are all things that I think plague a career in comparative politics if we are either ignoring area studies or only focused on debates and discussions that go on in multidisciplinary area studies communities. So the solution for CAS is part intellectual, but also part practical in terms of facilitating and advancing dialogue and putting area studies back on the map in a way that forces the discipline to take advantage of genuine bottom-up, on-the-ground insights, but recognize that these are insights that are potentially portable, that do have something to say to our disciplinary debates and theories. So I'll shut up there and thank you very much for having me for this very special event. Congratulations to UEA.
Thank you very much, Rudy.